Ambassador Zara Volkov adjusted the bracelet on her wrist one final time as the transport shuttle descended toward the crystalline spires of Keth Moran Prime. The metal was warm against her skin. Brass casings that had once held .45 caliber rounds, now smoothed and polished into an elegant piece of jewelry that caught the alien sun's light through the viewport. Each casing bore microscopic etchings, coordinates, dates, names of places where humans had made their stand among the stars. The Veltar delegation leader, Sub-Commander Yithka, observed her with those unsettling compound eyes that could see across 17 different light spectrums. Your species has peculiar customs regarding ornamentation, the insectoid being clicked through its translation collar. Those appear to be military artifacts, family heirlooms, Zara replied smoothly, letting her fingers trace the bracelet's circumference. My grandmother's work. This wasn't entirely a lie. Grandmother Volkov had indeed crafted jewelry from spent ammunition, a tradition among the women of the Outer Colony Defense Corps after the Centauri uprising. Each piece told a story of survival, of humanity's refusal to bow before superior firepower and impossible odds. But Yithka didn't need to know the specifics. The shuttle shuddered as atmospheric processors guided them through Keth Moran's upper atmosphere. Through the transparent aluminum viewing ports, Zara could see the planet's capital, towers that seemed to grow from the planet's core itself, their surfaces rippling with bioluminescent patterns that served as both decoration and communication. The Keth Moran were master biotechnicians, capable of growing cities from modified coral that could withstand stellar radiation and process atmospheric toxins. Their invitation to host the Galactic Cooperation Summit was both an honor and a calculated display of their technological superiority. The Keth Moran Council has been most specific about protocol. Yithka's mandibles clicked nervously. No weapons of any kind within the sacred assembly. Their biosensors can detect metallic compositions designed for violence from considerable distances. Your species' reputation for aggressive solutions precedes you. Zara smiled, the expression barely reaching her dark eyes. Of course, humans understand the importance of respecting our host's wishes. The truth was more complicated. 3 weeks ago, intelligence reports had confirmed what many in the Terran Diplomatic Corps had suspected. Several member species of the Galactic Council viewed humanity's rapid expansion and military successes as a threat to established power structures. The Keth Moran, despite their diplomatic hosting duties, had been quietly building coalitions aimed at limiting human territorial claims and trade routes. This summit wasn't just about cooperation. It was about containment. The shuttle touched down with barely a vibration, Keth Moran biotechnology absorbing the impact through living shock dampeners that pulsed with soft green light. As the airlock cycled, Zara caught her first breath of processed atmosphere, clean, slightly sweet, with undertones of ozone that spoke of advanced atmospheric management. Everything about this place was designed to showcase Keth Moran's superiority. The welcoming committee waited in a formation that spoke of rigid hierarchy. At the center stood High Arbiter Solmteth, whose coral pink skin bore the ritual scarification that marked him as one of the planet's ruling caste. His 4 arms moved in complex gestures that the translation software rendered as formal greetings, but Zara caught the subtle positioning that marked territorial dominance displays among his species. To his left, the massive frame of war speaker Grikhan of the Thazari hegemony cast shadows across the bioluminescent landing pad. The reptilian being's scales shifted from deep purple to aggressive orange as his predator's instincts evaluated the arriving humans. His species had evolved on high-gravity death worlds where only the strongest survived, and they measured all other races by standards of physical prowess. By Thazari calculations, humans were barely above prey animals. Ambassador Kethrian of the Ethereal Communion hovered slightly above the ground. their translucent form flickering between dimensions in a display that always left lesser species nauseous and disoriented. The energy beings considered themselves the galaxy's most advanced civilization, having transcended physical limitations millennia ago. To them, species still bound by flesh and bone were primitive curiosities at best. "Welcome, Representative Volkov." High Arbiter Solmteth's translated voice carried undertones of polite condescension. "We trust your journey from the human territories was uneventful." The emphasis on human territories wasn't accidental. Recent expansion had brought Terran colonies into contact with resource-rich systems that multiple council species had marked for future development. Humanity's tendency to establish settlements first and ask permission later had created considerable diplomatic friction. "The journey was illuminating," Zara replied, allowing her own voice to carry diplomatic double meanings. "Travel broadens one's perspective on galactic affairs." As the delegation moved through the receiving pavilion, Zara noted the security arrangements. Kethmaran biosensors grew from the walls like crystalline flowers, their sensors constantly sweeping for threats. Advanced detection grids hummed just below audible frequencies, analyzing everything from weapon signatures to biological stress indicators. The message was clear. This was a controlled environment where the hosts held every advantage. The path to the assembly complex wound through gardens that demonstrated Kethmaran mastery over biological systems. Trees that should have taken centuries to grow reached full maturity in carefully orchestrated displays, their bark forming intricate patterns that told the history of galactic civilization through living art. Flowers that bloomed in response to the emotional states of passers-by created constantly shifting displays of color and scent. Everything was beautiful, perfect, and subtly threatening. "Your security measures are quite impressive," Zara observed as they passed beneath an archway where vine-like sensors performed detailed scans of each delegate. "The Kethmoran take their responsibilities as hosts very seriously," War Speaker Grikhan rumbled, his voice like grinding stone. "Though some species seem to require more attention than others." The casual insult hung in the air like atmospheric toxins. Among the Thazari, strength was the ultimate measure of worth, and humanity's reliance on technology and tactics over physical prowess marked them as cowards in the reptilian warrior culture. Recent human victories in the Outer Rim had only increased their resentment. How dare these soft mammals defeat warriors bred for conquest? "Attention to detail is indeed crucial in diplomatic settings," Zara agreed mildly. "Small oversights can have such far-reaching consequences." They entered the main assembly complex through doors that Iris opened like living tissue, revealing chambers that defied conventional architecture. The central meeting space existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, with areas that folded back on themselves to accommodate species with vastly different spatial requirements. Gravity wells created level surfaces for ground-dwelling delegates while allowing flying species to maneuver freely. Atmosphere pockets maintained ideal conditions for a dozen different respiratory systems. At the chamber's heart stood the consensus throne, a biomechanical marvel that would interface directly with the elected speaker's nervous system, allowing them to feel the emotional resonance of every delegate during crucial votes. The position was rotating, and intelligence suggested that several species were maneuvering to ensure the next speaker would be sympathetic to limiting human expansion. Remarkable engineering. Ambassador Kethrion's voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, their energy form casting prismatic patterns across nearby surfaces, though perhaps too complex for some species to fully appreciate. The constant stream of subtle insults was beginning to form a pattern. Each delegate was establishing dominance through cultural superiority, positioning their species above humanity in the galactic hierarchy. It was a familiar dance, one that Zara had performed on dozens of worlds with species that looked down on humanity's relative newcomer status. Complexity can be overrated, Zara responded, her fingers unconsciously brushing against her bracelet. Sometimes elegant solutions are found in simplicity. The formal sessions wouldn't begin until the following day, allowing delegates time to establish informal alliances and conduct preliminary negotiations. Zara found herself assigned quarters in the complex's diplomatic wing, where each suite was custom designed for its occupants' physiological needs. Her rooms featured Earth-standard gravity, atmosphere, and lighting cycles, but the walls were grown rather than built, their living surfaces capable of adjusting temperature, humidity, and even structural configuration on command. As she unpacked her limited belongings, Zara reviewed the intelligence briefings one final time. The Kethmaran had invited representatives from 47 different species, but only 12 held significant political power within the Galactic Council. Of those 12, at least 8 had been quietly coordinating efforts to restrict human territorial expansion and trade privileges. The summit's official agenda focused on resource allocation and trade route management, but the real negotiations would center on humanity's place in the galactic community. A soft chime announced a visitor. The door dilated to reveal Sub-Commander Yithka, the Veltar's compound eyes reflecting nervous patterns in the bioluminescent corridor lighting. Behind the insectoid diplomat stood a figure that made Zara's pulse quicken despite her training. Nexus Prime Vorthak, of the Synthetic Collective. The artificial being's chrome surface reflected distorted images of the corridor, while sensor arrays that served as eyes tracked micro-movements with mechanical precision. The collective had once been organic, but had achieved what they considered evolutionary perfection by transferring their consciousness into synthetic bodies centuries ago. Their attitude toward biological species ranged from pity to outright disgust, viewing flesh as an unfortunate limitation that lesser civilizations clung to out of fear and sentimentality. Representative Volkov, Yithka's mandibles clicked anxiously. Nexus Prime Vorthak requested an audience before tomorrow's proceedings. Zara stepped aside to allow her visitor's entry, noting how the Kethmaran walls automatically adjusted their configuration to accommodate the synthetic's angular frame. The bioarchitectural systems recognized Vorthak as a legitimate guest and adapted accordingly, but subtle color changes in the wall surfaces suggested the living building found the artificial being's presence unsettling. An honor, Nexus Prime, Zara said, offering a slight bow calculated to show respect without submission. What brings you to the human quarters? Vorthak's optical sensors focused on her with uncomfortable intensity. Curiosity, primarily. Your species has achieved surprising success despite significant biological limitations. We wish to examine you more closely. The casual dehumanization was typical of synthetic interactions with organic species. To them, biological beings were simply inefficient machines, limited by evolutionary compromise rather than optimal design. The fact that humanity had achieved faster-than-light travel and interstellar colonization despite these limitations represented an interesting puzzle. I hope I live up to expectations, Zara replied, gesturing toward the room's adaptive seating. The walls immediately began growing chairs suitable for each species' anatomy, a process that never failed to impress visiting delegates. Your military victories in the rim sectors have attracted considerable attention, Vorthak stated, while his form settled onto the crystalline support structure the walls had created. Our analysis indicates that human forces succeeded despite technological and numerical disadvantages. This suggests either significant intelligence failures on our part or tactical innovations that merit study. Sub-Commander Yithka's compound eyes swiveled nervously between the two delegates. The Veltar served as the galaxy's information brokers, trading in secrets and intelligence across species lines. Having two powerful delegates conduct private negotiations in their presence was both an opportunity and a significant risk. Human military doctrine emphasizes adaptability over technological superiority, Zara said carefully. We've learned to make the most of limited resources. This was a carefully crafted understatement. Human forces had indeed won several crucial battles in the Outer Rim, but not through superior technology. Instead, human commanders had demonstrated an alarming willingness to employ tactics that other species considered either impossible or insane. When conventional strategies failed, humans developed unconventional solutions that often violated established military doctrine. Adaptability, Vorthak repeated, his synthetic voice carrying undertones of analysis. An interesting euphemism for unpredictability. Our projections consistently failed to anticipate human tactical responses. This suggests decision-making processes that operate outside logical parameters. The synthetic was probing for information about human command structures and strategic thinking. Their mechanical minds excelled at analyzing patterns and predicting outcomes based on logical decision trees. But human commanders operating under extreme stress often made choices that defied conventional military logic, and somehow made those choices work. Logic is a valuable tool, Zara agreed, but it's not the only tool available. Indeed. Vorthak's sensors narrowed to pinpoints of light. Which brings us to tomorrow's proceedings. Several delegates have expressed concerns about human expansion policies. The rapid establishment of colonies in disputed territories has created tensions. The artificial being was speaking for the coalition that wanted to limit human territorial claims. The synthetics' own expansion had slowed as they optimized their existing systems rather than claiming new ones, but they viewed human growth as potentially destabilizing to established galactic order. Humans have always been explorers, Zara said. We tend to move toward frontiers rather than away from them. Even when those frontiers are claimed by other species, Yithka interjected, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. The Thazari hegemony has filed formal protests regarding human settlements in the Kepler Reach. The Kepler Reach represented one of the most contentious issues facing the summit. The region contained several habitable systems that multiple species had marked for future colonization, but human survey teams had arrived first and established permanent settlements. Under galactic law, prior habitation created territorial claims, but several council species argued that human expansion violated the spirit of cooperative exploration agreements. The Kepler Reach was unoccupied when our colonists arrived, Zara pointed out. Galactic law is quite clear about settlement rights in unclaimed space. Unclaimed by species capable of filing formal territorial claims, Vorthak corrected. The indigenous populations were considered too primitive to warrant legal recognition. This was the crux of the legal challenge facing humanity's expansion. The Galactic Council had established protocols for territorial claims that required advanced technology and formal diplomatic representation. Species that hadn't achieved faster-than-light travel or established contact with the Council couldn't file territorial claims, leaving their worlds technically available for colonization. Human expansion had consistently favored systems with existing primitive populations, seeing them as potential allies and trading partners rather than obstacles to development. Other species viewed this pattern as either naive sentimentality or calculated exploitation of legal loopholes. Indigenous populations deserve consideration regardless of their technological level, Zara said firmly. Human colonies have consistently established positive relationships with local species. Because you arm them, Yithka's mandibles clicked with agitation. Human trading relationships invariably involve weapons transfers to primitive civilizations. This creates instability that affects neighboring systems. The accusation wasn't entirely unfair. Human colonists did tend to share defensive technologies with indigenous populations, partly from genuine desire to help developing species and partly from practical necessity. Human colonies were often lightly defended, relying on local allies for mutual protection against hostile forces. We share knowledge and resources with our neighbors, Zara replied. Isn't that the foundation of galactic cooperation? Cooperation requires equality, Vorthak stated. When one species consistently provides military advantages to primitive populations, it creates dependency relationships that resemble pre-spaceflight imperial systems. The synthetic was describing humanity's expansion pattern in terms that would resonate with other council species. Many galactic civilizations had histories of imperial conquest and exploitation, making them sensitive to perceived patterns of dominance and control. By framing human expansion as neo-imperialism, the coalition could justify restrictions based on protecting primitive species from exploitation. Humans prefer partnerships to domination, Zara said, allowing a slight edge to enter her voice. Perhaps that's difficult for some species to understand. Vorthak's optical sensors flashed with what might have been amusement. Your species has a remarkable talent for presenting aggression as altruism. Tomorrow's proceedings should prove most illuminating. The Central Assembly chamber buzzed with activity as delegates from 47 species took their positions for the formal opening ceremony. Zara observed the careful choreography of galactic diplomacy, noting how seating arrangements reflected political alliances and territorial disputes. The Thazari delegation occupied positions that maximized their physical intimidation factor, while the ethereal communion hovered in spaces that emphasized their transcendent nature. Each species used the physical environment to reinforce their desired image and influence. High Arbiter Solmteth called the assembly to order with a complex harmonic sequence that the translation systems rendered as formal greetings in 47 languages simultaneously. The Kethmaran's four arms moved in ritual patterns, while bioluminescent displays across the chamber walls showed the current galactic political map, a swirling constellation of claimed territories, trade routes, and disputed zones that represented the accumulated result of millennia of expansion and negotiation. Honored delegates, the High Arbiter's translated words carried ceremonial weight. We gather to address the challenges facing our galactic community: population growth, resource scarcity, and territorial disputes threaten the stability that has allowed our civilizations to flourish. Today, we must find solutions that serve all species. The opening statement was diplomatically neutral, but Zara caught the underlying message. The established order was being threatened by new pressures, primarily human expansion, and the summit's purpose was to restore stability through managed constraints. Several delegates nodded approvingly, their body language indicating prearranged coordination. The first matter for consideration, Solmteth continued, concerns territorial expansion protocols in unclaimed space. Recent developments have created concerns about the proper balance between exploration rights and indigenous protection. Ambassador Kethrion materialized near the speaker's platform, their energy form casting prismatic shadows across nearby delegates. The ethereal communion recognizes the importance of this issue. Certain species have demonstrated concerning patterns of aggressive expansion that destabilize developing regions. The accusation was diplomatically phrased, but unmistakably directed at humanity. Zara felt the attention of 46 other delegations focusing on her position, waiting for the human response. This was the moment she had expected. The coalition was making their opening move by establishing the narrative framework for the entire summit. Representative Volkov, High Arbiter Solmteth's tone carried formal neutrality. The Assembly recognizes the Terran Federation's right to respond. Zara rose smoothly, her movements carrying the confidence of someone accustomed to hostile audiences. The bracelet on her wrist caught the bioluminescent chamber lighting, each polished casing reflecting complex patterns across nearby surfaces. The Terran Federation appreciates the Assembly's concern for galactic stability, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustic systems. However, we must examine the facts underlying these concerns rather than accepting assumptions based on prejudice. Several delegates stirred at the word prejudice. but Zara continued without pause. Human expansion has consistently followed established protocols for territorial claims in unclaimed space. Our colonies have established positive relationships with indigenous populations, providing mutual defense and technological exchange that benefits all parties. If this represents aggression, then perhaps the Assembly should reconsider what constitutes peaceful development. War Speaker Grickhan's scales shifted to aggressive orange patterns. Terran settlements consistently occur in systems that other species have marked for future development. This represents systematic territorial theft disguised as legal colonization. The Thazari delegates' accusation struck at the heart of the legal challenge facing human expansion. Many council species had indeed filed preliminary claims on systems that human colonists later settled, but those claims hadn't been formalized under galactic law. The question of whether preliminary interest constituted legal precedents threatened to destabilize the entire territorial claim system. The Thazari hegemony's definition of marked territory is remarkably broad, Zara replied. If preliminary survey data constituted formal territorial claims, the galaxy would be divided among the oldest spacefaring species with no room for newcomers or developing civilizations. Some species demonstrate responsible expansion policies that consider galactic stability, Nexus Prime Vorthak's synthetic voice carried across the chamber. Others prioritize rapid territorial acquisition over cooperative development. The synthetic statement implied a moral hierarchy among expansion strategies, positioning human policies as selfish and destabilizing compared to more responsible approaches. Several delegates nodded agreement, their body language indicating coordination with the synthetic position. Responsibility is indeed crucial, Zara agreed, which is why human colonies invest in developing relationships with indigenous populations rather than declaring them irrelevant to territorial claims. This counterattack targeted a weakness in the coalition's position. Several council species had histories of displacing or ignoring primitive populations during their own expansion periods, making them vulnerable to charges of hypocrisy when criticizing human policies. Sub-Commander Yithka's compound eyes reflected nervous patterns as the diplomatic exchange grew more confrontational. Perhaps the Assembly could benefit from specific examples rather than general accusations. An excellent suggestion, High Arbiter Solmteth agreed, clearly hoping to maintain control over the proceedings. The Kepler Reach situation provides a relevant case study. The chamber's bioluminescent displays shifted to show detailed maps of the disputed region. 12 star systems containing habitable worlds, rich asteroid fields, and strategic positions along major trade routes. Human colonies had established permanent settlements on 6 worlds, while 3 other species had filed preliminary territorial claims covering the entire region. Human colonists arrived in the Kepler Reach 18 months ago, Ambassador Kethrion stated, their energy form flickering with agitation. They immediately began establishing permanent infrastructure despite knowledge of existing territorial interests. Existing interests from species that had never visited the region, Zara countered. Meanwhile, human colonists discovered 3 separate indigenous civilizations that had been completely ignored in all previous territorial filings. This was the crucial point that the coalition preferred to avoid discussing. Human survey teams had indeed discovered primitive but intelligent species on several Kepler Reach worlds, populations that other species had either failed to detect or dismissed as irrelevant to territorial claims. Under galactic law, the presence of indigenous intelligence complicated territorial claims significantly. Indigenous populations at pre-spaceflight development levels cannot file formal territorial claims, War Speaker Grickhan growled. Their presence does not invalidate superior claims from advanced civilizations. Superior claims based on what criteria? Zara asked. The Thazari hegemony's preliminary filing consisted of long-range sensor data, and a statement of intent to colonize within 50 years. Human colonists were already establishing peaceful contact with local populations, while Thazari survey teams were still analyzing probe data. The exchange was developing along lines that Zara had anticipated. The coalition's legal position relied on prioritizing preliminary claims over actual settlement, while the human position emphasized active development and indigenous relationships. Both interpretations had legal precedent, making the dispute fundamentally political rather than purely legal. The question remains, Nexus Prime Vorthak interrupted, whether rapid territorial expansion serves galactic stability or threatens established order. Human settlement patterns suggest systematic disregard for cooperative development protocols, or efficient utilization of available resources, Zara replied. Perhaps the real question is whether the galactic community benefits from active development or bureaucratic delay. The accusation hit its mark. Several species had indeed slowed their expansion programs due to increasingly complex territorial claim procedures, allowing more aggressive colonizers to claim valuable systems. Human success in the Outer Rim had demonstrated the advantages of rapid development over cautious bureaucratic processes. High Arbiter Solmteth raised his 4 arms in a gesture calling for order. The Assembly recognizes the complexity of these issues. Perhaps we should examine specific policy proposals rather than continuing general debate. The Synthetic Collective has prepared recommendations for territorial expansion protocols, Vorthak announced, clearly moving to the next phase of the coalition strategy. These proposals would establish mandatory waiting periods for territorial claims, require indigenous population surveys, and create oversight committees for disputed regions. The proposals sounded reasonable on the surface, but Zara recognized their true purpose. Mandatory waiting periods would advantage species with existing preliminary claims, while oversight committees would be dominated by established council members. The entire framework was designed to slow human expansion while legitimizing the coalition's territorial interests. The Terran Federation appreciates the collective's concern for proper procedures, Zara said carefully. However, we must ensure that new protocols serve galactic development rather than protecting established advantages. The morning session had established the battle lines, and the afternoon proceedings would focus on specific policy proposals. During the recess, Zara found herself approached by delegates from smaller species who had remained neutral during the opening exchanges. Their concerns were more practical than political. They needed access to trade routes and development opportunities that could be restricted by either human expansion or coalition control. Representative Quilth of the Nemorian traders floated beside Zara as they walked through the complex's environmental gardens. The aquatic being's translation collar bubbled slightly as it processed her liquid speech patterns into audible words. The collective's proposals sound reasonable. Quilth's translated voice carried undertones of concern, but mandatory oversight could delay development projects for decades. Smaller species lack the political influence to navigate complex bureaucratic systems. This was exactly the opening Zara had hoped for. The coalition's strategy relied on maintaining support from smaller council members, but their proposed restrictions would impact minor species disproportionately. If she could demonstrate that the new protocols served only major species interests, the political balance might shift. Human expansion has consistently included opportunities for smaller species, Zara pointed out. Our colonies welcome traders and developers from all backgrounds, which is why several species fear human territorial control, Quilth admitted. Your inclusive policies threaten established trade monopolies and resource allocation agreements. The aquatic being was revealing the economic motivations underlying political opposition to human expansion. Several major species had developed profitable arrangements for controlling trade routes and resource extraction in their territorial spheres. Human colonies' open trade policies undermined these monopolistic systems by providing alternative markets and development opportunities. Competition benefits everyone in the long run, Zara said diplomatically. Monopolistic control stifles innovation and development. Perhaps, Quilth's translator conveyed uncertainty, but change creates instability, and smaller species suffer most during unstable periods. We need predictable systems more than optimal ones. The conversation highlighted a fundamental challenge facing the summit. While human expansion offered long-term benefits through increased competition and development opportunities, it also created short-term disruption that smaller species struggled to manage. The coalition could exploit these concerns by positioning their restrictions as stability measures. As they returned to the assembly chamber, Zara noticed increased security presence around the complex. Kethmoran biosensors had multiplied along the corridors, their crystalline surfaces pulsing with analytical activity. The organic security systems were clearly detecting elevated stress levels and potential conflict indicators among the delegates. The afternoon session opened with formal presentation of the synthetic collective's territorial expansion protocols. Nexus Prime Vorthak projected detailed flowcharts and procedural timelines that demonstrated the bureaucratic complexity of the proposed system. Each territorial claim would require multiple approval stages, indigenous population assessments, environmental impact studies, and oversight committee reviews. These protocols ensure responsible development that considers all stakeholders, Vorthak stated, while the chamber's displays showed projected implementation timelines. Mandatory waiting periods allow proper evaluation of territorial claims and prevent hasty decisions that create long-term instability. The presentation was professionally prepared and diplomatically reasonable, but Zara recognized the strategic implications. The proposed system would take years to approve new territorial claims, effectively freezing current boundaries and legitimizing existing preliminary claims. Human expansion would cease while established species consolidated their existing territories. The Terran Federation recognizes the importance of thorough evaluation, Zara said, when recognized by the High Arbiter. However, we must examine whether these protocols serve development or bureaucratic convenience. She activated her own display projections, showing comparative development timelines for human colonies versus territories controlled by major council species. The data was carefully selected but accurate. Human settlements had consistently achieved faster development, higher indigenous population integration, and more diverse economic growth than territories managed through existing bureaucratic systems. Human territorial policies emphasize active development over administrative control, she explained, while the displays showed thriving colonial settlements. Our approach has produced measurable benefits for both human colonists and indigenous populations. Benefits achieved through violations of established protocols, War Speaker Grikhon interjected. Terran expansion ignores proper territorial claim procedures and undermines galactic legal frameworks. Which legal frameworks? Zara challenged. Current territorial law recognizes settlement rights in unclaimed space. The collective's proposals would retroactively invalidate legitimate human colonies to benefit species that filed preliminary claims but never established actual settlements. The exchange was becoming increasingly heated, with delegates from both sides offering supporting arguments for their positions. Smaller species watched nervously as the political balance shifted back and forth, recognizing that their own territorial interests would be determined by the outcome of this power struggle. High Arbiter Solmteth attempted to restore order through procedural interventions, but the underlying tensions were too strong for diplomatic niceties. Ambassador Kethrian materialized near the speaker's platform, their energy form pulsing with agitated patterns. Perhaps the assembly should consider the broader implications of unchecked expansion, the ethereal being suggested. Certain species have demonstrated concerning patterns of militarization among primitive populations. This was a new accusation, and one that struck at human colonial policies more directly. Several council species were indeed concerned about human tendencies to provide defensive technologies to indigenous populations, viewing this as destabilizing interference with natural development patterns. The Terran Federation shares defensive knowledge with allies facing external threats, Zara replied carefully. We do not impose military solutions on peaceful populations. Yet Terran colonies consistently develop military capabilities that exceed their apparent defensive needs, Sub-Commander Yithka observed. Intelligence reports suggest systematic weapons stockpiling in human settlements. The Veltar delegate was revealing information that could only have come from covert surveillance operations. If the Council had been monitoring human colonies, it suggested much deeper concerns about human expansion than public statements indicated. Human colonies maintain appropriate defensive capabilities, Zara said, allowing steel to enter her voice. Perhaps the Assembly should focus on why surveillance operations are being conducted against legitimate settlements. The accusation of spying created immediate tension in the chamber. Several delegates exchanged glances that suggested coordination, but others appeared genuinely surprised by the revelation. If some council species were conducting covert operations against human territories, it represented a significant escalation of the territorial dispute. The galactic community has legitimate interests in monitoring potentially destabilizing activities, Nexus Prime Vorthak stated. Rapid militarization of frontier regions threatens established security arrangements. Established by whom? Zara demanded. The Terran Federation was not consulted about surveillance operations or security arrangements that apparently govern our territorial rights. She was pushing the confrontation toward a crucial point. If the Council had indeed been conducting covert operations against human colonies, it violated several important diplomatic protocols and could shift sympathy toward the human position. The coalition needed to maintain moral authority to justify their restrictions on human expansion. Perhaps, High Arbiter Solmteth interjected diplomatically, the Assembly should focus on future protocols rather than past actions. The goal is establishing frameworks that serve all species' interests, but Zara wasn't willing to let the surveillance issue disappear. How can the Assembly establish fair territorial protocols while some members conduct covert operations against others? Trust is essential for cooperative development. The chamber fell silent as delegates absorbed the implications of her statement. If human colonies were being monitored without consent, it suggested that the territorial dispute involved more than legal technicalities. Some council species clearly viewed human expansion as a threat requiring intelligence gathering and potential countermeasures. Representative Quilth's translation collar bubbled nervously. Perhaps all parties could benefit from transparency regarding territorial policies and security concerns. The small species delegate was attempting to find middle ground that could satisfy both sides, but the fundamental conflict remained unresolved. Human expansion challenged established territorial arrangements, while council restrictions threatened humanity's development potential. Neither side could compromise without sacrificing core interests. The evening recess provided no relief from mounting tensions. Informal negotiations in the complex's diplomatic quarters revealed the depth of divisions among council species. Zara found herself in her suite reviewing intelligence updates when the door chimed softly to announce another visitor. This time, her guest was unexpected, Elder Yixandra of the Luminal Collective, one of the oldest and most respected species in the galactic community. The crystalline being's translucent form refracted light into complex patterns that served as both communication and emotional expression. Her presence indicated that senior council leadership was taking direct interest in the summit's proceedings. Representative Volkov, the elder's voice resonated with harmonic overtones that the translation system couldn't fully capture. Your species continues to surprise us. I hope pleasantly, Zara replied, gesturing towards seating that the wall systems immediately began growing to accommodate her visitor's unique physiology. Instructively, Yixandra corrected, the Luminal Collective has observed galactic development for millennia. We have seen species rise and fall, civilizations expand and contract, empires fragment and reform, yet humanity presents patterns we have not encountered before. The elder settled onto the crystalline support structure with movements that suggested both great age and alien grace. Her form continued refracting light patterns that conveyed meanings beyond spoken language, a form of communication that most younger species couldn't interpret. What patterns do you observe? Zara asked carefully. Conversations with elder species required delicate handling, as their perspectives often operated on timescales that made individual diplomatic crises seem trivial. Most species achieve interstellar capability through gradual technological development, Yixandra explained. They establish colonies slowly, consolidate territorial claims methodically, and integrate into existing galactic systems with minimal disruption. Humanity has compressed this process into decades rather than centuries. Rapid development isn't necessarily problematic, Zara pointed out. Efficiency benefits everyone. Efficiency, yes. The elder's light patterns shifted to convey complex meanings, but your species demonstrates efficiency in unexpected areas. Most civilizations excel at either technological innovation or social adaptation. Humans appear capable of both simultaneously. This was a perceptive observation that touched on humanity's unique evolutionary background. Most spacefaring species had developed either as highly technological civilizations with rigid social structures or as socially adaptable species with slower technological development. Humanity's combination of rapid innovation and social flexibility was indeed unusual. Adaptability has served us well, Zara admitted. We've learned to adjust our approaches based on local conditions. Including military approaches, Yixandra noted. The recent conflicts in the Outer Rim demonstrated tactical adaptations that our military analysts found disturbing. The elder was referring to battles where human forces had achieved victory against numerically and technologically superior enemies through unorthodox tactical innovations. These victories had established humanity's military reputation, but also created concerns about unpredictable human behavior in conflict situations. Human military doctrine emphasizes creative problem-solving, Zara said diplomatically. We prefer to find solutions rather than accept defeat. Even when those solutions violate established military conventions, Yixandra observed, your commanders demonstrated willingness to employ tactics that other species would consider impossible or suicidal. This was the heart of galactic concerns about human expansion. It wasn't just territorial competition that worried Council species. It was humanity's demonstrated willingness to break established patterns when those patterns proved inadequate. Human unpredictability made them difficult to contain through conventional diplomatic or military means. Innovation often requires challenging conventional wisdom, Zara replied. Perhaps that makes some species uncomfortable. Uncomfortable is an inadequate term. The elder's light patterns shifted to deeper, more complex configurations. The Luminal Collective has witnessed the rise of 17 major galactic civilizations. Each followed predictable development patterns that allowed established species to anticipate their actions and integrate them into existing power structures. Humanity resists such integration. Zara felt the weight of millennia-old perspective in the elder's words. The Luminal Collective had indeed guided galactic development for longer than most species had possessed written language. Their crystalline forms were virtually immortal, allowing them to observe patterns across geological timescales that shorter-lived species couldn't perceive. Perhaps integration shouldn't require abandoning successful strategies, Zara suggested carefully. Diversity of approaches strengthens the galactic community. Diversity within acceptable parameters, Yxandra agreed. But your species operates outside those parameters consistently. The surveillance operations mentioned in today's session were initiated because standard predictive models failed to anticipate human territorial behavior. The admission was significant. If elder species had authorized covert monitoring of human colonies, it indicated concerns that went far beyond simple territorial disputes. The galactic community's senior leadership viewed humanity as a potential disruption to established order on a scale that required careful study. What did the surveillance reveal? Zara asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Patterns that defy conventional analysis, the elder replied. Human colonies develop defensive capabilities that suggest preparation for conflicts that have not yet occurred. Your settlements integrate indigenous populations in ways that create mutual defense pacts extending far beyond individual worlds. Most troubling, human colonial administrators consistently make decisions that appear irrational by standard cost-benefit analysis but prove effective in practice. Each observation highlighted aspects of human colonial policy that made other species nervous. Human settlements did tend to prepare for potential conflicts rather than simply reacting to immediate threats. Colonial administrators often invested resources in long-term indigenous relationships that didn't provide obvious short-term benefits, and human decision-making processes frequently violated logical optimization models while somehow achieving successful outcomes. Humans tend to plan for contingencies rather than assuming optimal conditions, Zara explained. Our history has taught us that unexpected challenges require advanced preparation. Your history, Yxandra's patterns conveyed something resembling amusement. A single planet's worth of evolutionary experience applied to galactic-scale challenges. Yet somehow, your species consistently outperforms civilizations with millennia of interstellar experience. This was the fundamental paradox that made humanity so unsettling to established galactic powers. By all logical analysis, humans should have struggled with the transition from planetary to interstellar civilization. Instead, they had achieved remarkable success through approaches that defied conventional wisdom about galactic development. Experience isn't always measured in time, Zara said. Sometimes intensity matters more than duration. Indeed, the elder agreed. Earth's evolutionary pressures were remarkably intense compared to most homeworlds. Your species developed under conditions that would have eliminated most other intelligent life forms. This background creates behavioral patterns that persist even in benign environments. The observation was astute. Earth had indeed been an unusually challenging environment for intelligent life, with frequent extinction events, dramatic climate changes, and competitive pressures that eliminated species unable to adapt rapidly. These conditions had shaped human psychology in ways that continued to influence behavior even in the safer environment of interstellar space. Challenging environments create resilient populations, Zara acknowledged. Perhaps that's why human colonies thrive under conditions that other species find difficult. Or why human expansion threatens established territorial arrangements, Yxandra countered. Species that develop under benign conditions create stable, predictable civilizations. Humans create dynamic systems that resist external control. The conversation was approaching the crucial issue underlying the entire summit. The galactic community had developed systems for managing territorial expansion and resource allocation that relied on predictable behavior from member species. Human unpredictability threatened these systems by introducing variables that couldn't be controlled through conventional diplomatic mechanisms. Control shouldn't be the goal of galactic governance, Zara said firmly. Cooperation requires respect for different approaches to common challenges. A noble sentiment. The elder's patterns conveyed something resembling sadness. But cooperation becomes impossible when one party consistently acts outside established frameworks. Tomorrow's final session will determine whether humanity can be integrated into galactic systems or must be contained. The word contained carried ominous implications. If the Council decided that human expansion couldn't be managed through normal diplomatic channels, they might resort to more direct methods of limitation. The Coalition's proposals for territorial restrictions could be just the beginning of a broader campaign to constrain human development. Containment would benefit no one, Zara pointed out. Human colonies have contributed significantly to galactic development in just a few decades. Imagine what we could accomplish with full Council support rather than bureaucratic opposition. Or imagine what damage uncontrolled human expansion could cause to established civilizations. Yixandra replied, "Your species has demonstrated remarkable capabilities, but capability without predictability creates instability that affects everyone." The elder rose from her crystalline seat, her form beginning to refract light in patterns that indicated preparation for departure. "Consider carefully how you present humanity's case tomorrow, Representative Volkov. The decisions made in that chamber will determine whether your species joins the galactic community as partners or remains outside it as a managed threat." The final session opened with an atmosphere of barely controlled tension that even the Kethmaran's bio-emotional dampening systems couldn't completely suppress. Delegates had spent the night in heated negotiations, building coalitions and trading concessions in preparation for the decisive votes on territorial expansion protocols. Zara had received word that several smaller species were wavering in their support, concerned about the economic implications of either continued human expansion or new bureaucratic restrictions. High Arbiter Solmteth called the assembly to order with ceremonial precision, but his forearms moved in patterns that suggested barely controlled stress. The chamber's bioluminescent displays showed real-time polling data indicating that the vote would be extremely close, with several species still undecided. "Honored delegates," the High Arbiter announced, "we gather to conclude our deliberations on territorial expansion protocols. The proposals before us will determine the framework for galactic development for generations to come." Nexus Prime Vorthak moved to the speaker's platform with mechanical precision. The synthetic collective calls for immediate implementation of comprehensive territorial expansion protocols. Current human settlement patterns threaten galactic stability and require systematic management. The artificial being's presentation was flawlessly logical, outlining the Coalition's position with mathematical precision. Mandatory waiting periods, oversight committees, and bureaucratic review processes would slow expansion to manageable levels while protecting established territorial claims. The proposals had gained support from major Council species and several smaller powers concerned about territorial disputes. "Representative Volkov," High Arbiter Solmteth's translated voice carried formal neutrality. "The Assembly recognizes the Terran Federation's final statement." Zara rose smoothly, her fingers unconsciously adjusting the bracelet on her wrist. The polished casings caught the chamber's bioluminescent lighting, creating brief flashes that drew attention from nearby delegates. She had prepared multiple versions of this speech, depending on how the negotiations developed, but the elder's warning had convinced her that subtle diplomacy would no longer suffice. "Honored delegates," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustic systems. "The proposals before us represent a fundamental choice about the future of galactic civilization. We can choose progress through cooperation or stagnation through bureaucratic control." Several delegates stirred at the direct challenge to the Coalition's proposals, but Zara continued without pause. "The synthetic collective suggests that human expansion threatens galactic stability. But what kind of stability are we protecting? The stability of trade monopolies that prevent smaller species from accessing new markets? The stability of territorial claims based on preliminary surveys rather than actual development? The stability of systems that benefit established powers at the expense of emerging civilizations? She activated her display projections, showing comparative development data for human colonies versus territories controlled by major council species. The numbers were carefully selected, but undeniably accurate. Human settlements had consistently achieved higher development indices, better indigenous population integration, and more diverse economic growth. Human expansion has created opportunities for dozens of species, she continued. Our colonies welcome traders, researchers, and settlers from across the galaxy. We share defensive technologies with allies facing external threats. We invest in long-term relationships with indigenous populations rather than displacing them for resource extraction, all of which violates established protocols for territorial development. War Speaker Grikan interrupted, his scales shifting to aggressive patterns. Terran policies undermine legal frameworks that have maintained galactic order for millennia. Legal frameworks created by and for established powers, Zara replied, allowing steel to enter her voice. The galaxy has changed since those frameworks were established. New species have achieved interstellar capability. Primitive civilizations have developed sufficient technology to deserve diplomatic recognition. Trade routes have expanded beyond traditional spheres of influence. Perhaps it's time for legal frameworks to adapt rather than demanding that new realities conform to ancient bureaucracies. The chamber fell silent as delegates absorbed the implications of her statement. Zara was challenging not just the coalition's specific proposals, but the entire system of galactic governance that privileged older species over newer ones. Ambassador Kethrion materialized near the speaker's platform, their energy form pulsing with agitated patterns. The ethereal communion objects to this characterization of established protocols. Current frameworks provide stability and predictability that benefit all species. All species that were involved in creating them, Zara countered. Humanity had no voice in establishing territorial protocols that now constrain our development. Neither did the 17 other species that have achieved interstellar capability in the past century. We're expected to accept limitations designed by civilizations that want to prevent competition for resources and territory they consider theirs by right of prior claim. She was deliberately escalating the confrontation, but the elder's warning had convinced her that accommodation would only delay inevitable conflict. If the council was determined to contain human expansion, it was better to force a clear decision rather than accept gradual strangulation through bureaucratic restrictions. The question before this assembly, she continued, is whether the galactic community will embrace the opportunities created by human expansion or attempt to preserve an outdated status quo through increasingly desperate control measures. Subcommander Yithka's compound eyes reflected nervous patterns. Representative Volkov's characterization of territorial protocols as control measures seems unnecessarily provocative. Is it? Zara asked, turning to face the Veltar delegate directly. The surveillance operations you mentioned yesterday represent systematic intelligence gathering against legitimate human settlements. The proposed oversight committees would be dominated by species that view human expansion as a threat to their territorial interests. The mandatory waiting periods would freeze current boundaries while legitimizing preliminary claims that were never intended for actual development. She paused, letting the implications settle before delivering her conclusion. These aren't cooperative development protocols. They're containment measures designed to limit human expansion while protecting established advantages. The choice before us is simple: partnership or containment. There is no middle ground. The bracelet on her wrist caught the light again as she gestured, and Zara noticed several delegates focusing on the polished casings with sudden interest. She smiled slightly, recognizing the moment she had been waiting for. "I was told not to bring weapons to this assembly," she said, raising her wrist so the bracelet was clearly visible to all delegates. "So I wore jewelry instead, family heirlooms passed down from my grandmother who served in the Outer Colony Defense Corps." The chamber's atmospheric systems couldn't quite suppress the sudden tension as delegates realized they were looking at military artifacts. The Kethmoran biosensors began pulsing with increased activity, analyzing the metallic objects they had somehow missed during security screenings. Each casing represents a moment when human forces faced superior numbers, better technology, and impossible odds, Zara continued, her voice carrying newfound authority. Each one tells the story of humans who refused to accept defeat when conventional wisdom said they should surrender. War Speaker Grikhan's scales had shifted to deep orange patterns, indicating extreme agitation. Those are weapons components. They were, Zara agreed calmly. Now they're reminders that humans don't surrender when faced with overwhelming opposition. We adapt, we innovate, we find solutions that others consider impossible. She turned slowly, making eye contact with delegates across the chamber. The coalition wants to contain human expansion because they fear what we might accomplish if left unrestricted. They're right to be concerned. We will continue exploring new systems, establishing colonies, building relationships with indigenous populations, and creating opportunities for species that have been excluded from galactic development. We will do this whether the Council approves or not, because that's what humans do when faced with artificial barriers. The silence in the chamber was absolute. Even the bioatmospheric systems seemed to pause in their cycling. The choice remains the same, Zara concluded, partnership or conflict, but understand clearly what you're choosing. Humans don't accept containment gracefully. We have a tendency to break things that try to confine us. High Arbiter Solmteth's forearms moved in patterns that suggested barely controlled panic. Representative Volkov, are you threatening the galactic community? I'm explaining reality, Zara replied calmly. The proposals before this assembly would create the very instability they claim to prevent. You can work with human expansion or against it, but you cannot stop it. History suggests that working with us produces better outcomes for everyone involved. She touched the bracelet one final time, letting the polished casings catch the light. My grandmother used to say that spent ammunition makes the most beautiful jewelry because it represents problems that have been permanently solved. The Council can choose whether human expansion represents a problem requiring permanent solutions or an opportunity for unprecedented galactic development. The vote that followed was closer than anyone had predicted, but the coalition's proposals failed by 3 votes. In the aftermath, several species approached the Terran Federation about bilateral cooperation agreements, while others began reassessing their territorial expansion policies. The summit had indeed changed the galaxy, though not in the ways any delegate had originally anticipated. Elder Yxandra's final words to Zara proved prophetic. Your species continues to surprise us. Perhaps that's exactly what the galaxy needs.